Do your shoulders look like any one of these? Whether you're dealing with scapular winging, tight traps, or anterior shoulder pain, it's roughly all rooted from the same problem. That problem being a poor relationship between how your scapula and humerus interact with one another. Your shoulder is the most mobile joint on your body. This sucker on average can move upwards of 180 degrees in both flexion and abduction. That's really something when you compare it to its larger counterpart at the pelvis, which has 120 degrees of flexion, but only a measly 45 degrees of abduction. Come on, pelvis. I thought you were better than that. Just kidding, pelvis. I know you're doing your best. Jokes aside, the anatomy of the shoulders is wildly fascinating, and from an evolutionary standpoint is what differentiated us from other primates. With the shoulder having the ability to articulate in all three planes of motion in a very broad range of motion, it allows us to generate one of the fastest motions the human body is capable of, which is throwing. However, running, throwing, and hunting on the savannah isn't really commonplace nowadays, at least it isn't for me. A dormant lifestyle, injury, poor patterning can create an array of different issues through this highly versatile joint. And as a byproduct of that, it is important that we approach it with such care. In this video, we are gonna do just that and take you step by step through 3 different exercises that will take your shoulder health and function to the next level. Let's do it. All right, so if you deal with scapular winging or you have tight traps or shoulders, this first exercise is gonna be awesome for you. You're gonna wanna grab a yoga block. You can also use a water bottle or a book. And what we're gonna attempt to do here is get the scapulas a little bit more flush on the rib cage. And we're gonna start to introduce some pressure and stability around a certain position. So you can do this both from a seated and a standing position. What we're gonna wanna do is grab the tool of your choice. You're gonna wanna start with a gentle squeeze against the tool. And what we're gonna work on is something that I call an elbow scoop. So what we're gonna try to do is almost attempt to pull the humerus a little bit out of the socket and kind of scoop the elbows in front of us. And as we kind of pull the humerus out of the socket a little bit, that's gonna pull our scapulas into a subtle protraction, but it's also gonna allow it to get a little bit more flush on the rib cage itself. So now that you got the elbow scoop, you got the squeeze against the tool of your choice, what we're gonna start to do is breathe into this imaginary cylinder through our shoulder girdle. So what you can sense as you're going through this is that you're projecting the breath in all 3 directions. You're both trying to breathe kind of into the upper pec fibers, also in between the shoulder blades, but almost underneath the armpits and kind of projecting towards either wall on either side of you. And all that we're trying to do here is create some spacing through the shoulders around some stability and tension, and then kind of using the pressure as a way to create length kind of away from our midline. I would suggest spending anywhere between 45 seconds to about 90 seconds on the high end, really trying to send pressure in that cylindrical fashion, and then just trying to keep some level of shoulder stability kind of through the lats and the serratus to support yourself in this position. Now, this next technique has become one of my household favorites. Really, anyone who has almost any type of shoulder pain or problem, I found this to be a very powerful exercise. So for this one, we're gonna start to introduce a couple different concepts, and you are gonna be limited by the range of your external rotation mobility, as well as what the pec fibers are going to allow. So if you find that your pecs are usually quite jammed up, or you kind of have that anterior shoulder pain, I might suggest doing a little bit of release work before you get into this next one. So we're gonna keep the tool selection the same. You can use a yoga block. You can also just use the wall, but a foam roller also works really well here. So starting in a seated position, what we're gonna do is get parallel with the wall beside us. We're gonna start by taking the elbow into the block. Now, once you have your elbow pressing into the tool of your choice, what we're gonna start to create is something I call the shoulder shelf. Now, the shoulder shelf consists of integrating muscles of the lats and the serratus, kind of almost all the tissues underneath the scapula and shoulder itself, to kind of keep the shoulder girdle supported in space. What we want to be mindful of from a starting position is that the scapula isn't jammed up against the spine, and that we're not in an excessively elevated position of the scapula where the traps would be overcompensating. So now that we have the spacing of the scapula away from the spine, we're going to start to think about almost envisioning that we're tucking the scapula underneath the ribs, or almost posteriorly tilting the scapula through external rotation of the humerus. What this is gonna allow for is for the fibers on the anterior side of the shoulder to really start to get length, but it's going to happen from the support network of what's happening kind of through the lower and mid traps. So up until this point, we've created a lot of stability and spacing kind of the scapula. And what we can start to play with now is where the humeral positioning is. So now we're gonna take the humerus, or this bone that kind of comes out from your shoulder, and we're gonna think about trying to leave the elbow behind while we slowly bring our center of mass away from the wall. This is gonna promote even more length coming in through the anterior shoulder, and it's really gonna start to challenge the stability of the scapula and all the fibers to keep everything supported in that position. Once you have the appropriate stability and sensation kind of coming through the shoulder girdle, like most of our exercises, you can start to incorporate some pressure where you're kind of thinking about projecting the shoulder away from you via the breath. If you're doing a static hold, what I would recommend is 15 to 20 seconds, give yourself a short break, and then go back to it. So let's pop up to the feet. We've been doing a lot of stuff seated, so let's stand up and let's start to introduce some of that flow, some of that rhythm. We've been introducing a lot of the tension kind of involved to support the shoulder. We've kind of gone over conceptually what needs to happen there. So let's work on some rhythmic arm cross swings. So as I was mentioning at the beginning of this video, one of the fastest motions the human body has capacity for is throwing. Now there's a lot of intricacies to throwing, but we're gonna keep this relatively isolated to the shoulder and what kind of needs to happen with this internal and external rotation element. So all we're gonna do is just have our feet kind of side by side, and we're gonna start with a swing pattern, kind of coming over, let's go our left hip. I'm gonna start to open up across the right shoulder. And all we're gonna focus on is just rotating the whole arm inward and then outward. And what you can kind of feel as we're going through this is kind of this opening and closing effect. So as I go through the swing phase over the hip, I'm kind of closing off tension a little bit on the front side of my body, as well as through the shoulder. And then as I open up my arm and I kind of open the palm, you can think about leaning back a little bit and trying to find some extension through your whole body. This is gonna allow you to create some length through the front and the back side of your body, all while using the shoulder to link us to the motion. Now, all the same principles apply here when we start to go into that external rotation and we're opening up. See if you can not allow the trap to overcompensate too much or allow the scapula to get drawn in too much. Really think about projecting the fingertips and the whole arm away from you, and that's gonna allow you to keep that shelf and that spacing of the shoulder. And just like anything else, the more you practice it, the more intuitive and unconscious it's gonna become. That's why we always start with the corrective exercises first, so the body kind of understands where sensation needs to be. And then we can start to add a little bit more of that flow and dynamism to the motion. Work through this one for anywhere between 12 to 14 reps on either side, and really think about projecting the fingertips away from you. So I'm not sure if you recall, but do you remember at the beginning of the video, I mentioned the shoulder's counterpart? Well, it turns out that they are pretty important as well. So you can go check a video I did on them right here.